I've always believed that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through decades of love, sacrifice, and quiet strength. When you've raised children, buried a husband, and weathered life's storms with grace, you expect certain courtesies. But sometimes the people closest to you forget who you are beneath the gray hair and gentle smile. Sometimes they see you as nothing more than furniture, taking up space in their carefully curated lives. That Tuesday evening in my son's kitchen, I learned exactly how my daughter-in-law viewed me. Her words cut deeper than any blade. "She's just taking up room." But what she didn't know was that this old woman had more fight left in her than anyone imagined. What she didn't expect was that I had the means to show her exactly how much room I could actually take up. This is the story of how a casual cruelty became the catalyst for the most empowering decision of my 73 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lourdes Smith, and for 7 decades I've called Oregon home. Not the trendy Portland that tourists flock to, but the real Oregon, the small coastal town of Bandon, where the cranberry bogs stretch toward the Pacific and everyone knows your name before you introduce yourself. I've lived through 3 major recessions, buried my husband of 48 years, and raised 2 sons who grew up to be decent men, even if one of them married poorly. The house where I've spent the last 35 years sits on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the harbor where my late husband Robert used to dock his fishing boat. It's a modest 2-story Victorian with weathered cedar shingles and a wraparound porch that's seen better days. The roses I planted the year we moved in have grown wild and magnificent, climbing the latticework Robert built with his own hands. Inside, the hardwood floors creak in all the familiar places, and the kitchen still smells faintly of the thousands of meals I've prepared within its walls. After Robert passed 5 years ago, the house felt simultaneously too big and too small. Too big for one woman rattling around in rooms filled with memories. Too small to contain the grief that seemed to expand and fill every corner. My younger son Marcus, bless his heart, suggested I might be happier in one of those senior living communities with organized activities and built-in friendships. But I wasn't ready to surrender my independence, and I certainly wasn't ready to abandon the life Robert and I had built together. My older son David lived just 20 minutes away in Coos Bay with his wife Jessica and their twin daughters Emma and Sophie. David inherited his father's steady temperament and work ethic. He manages the regional office of a lumber company and has provided well for his family. But somewhere along the way, he also inherited an unfortunate tendency to defer to his wife's opinions, even when those opinions were less than charitable. Jessica arrived in David's life like a perfectly organized storm. She was 32 to his 38 when they met, already established in her career as a real estate agent with strong opinions about property values, home staging, and what constituted good investment decisions. She had sleek blonde hair that never seemed to move, even in Oregon's persistent coastal wind, and a wardrobe that looked like it came straight from a catalog titled Successful Professional Woman. Everything about her was precise, calculated, and faintly disapproving of anything that didn't meet her exacting standards. I tried to like Jessica. I really did. When David first brought her home for Sunday dinner, I prepared all his favorite dishes and set the good china. She complimented the pot roast, but suggested I might consider using a meat thermometer to ensure optimal temperature. She admired my garden, but mentioned that native plants were more environmentally responsible and required less maintenance. She thanked me for the meal but declined seconds, explaining she was watching her carb intake. Over the years, Jessica's suggestions became more frequent and less subtle. She recommended interior designers who could update my living room. She brought paint samples that would brighten my kitchen. She gifted me organizing systems that would help me streamline my belongings. Each gesture came wrapped in kindness, but underneath lay an unmistakable message. I was living wrong, and she knew better. The twins, now 14, had grown up splitting their time between their modern home with its open floor plan and smart home technology, and my old-fashioned house with its creaky floors and rooms full of what Jessica diplomatically called vintage items. Emma and Sophie were polite children, well-mannered in the way that comes from strict household rules rather than genuine warmth. They called me Grandma Lourdes and dutifully hugged me when prompted, but I could see them comparing my humble surroundings to their mother's Pinterest-perfect world. I never complained about Jessica's comments or suggestions. Robert used to say that marriage was like learning to dance. Sometimes you lead, sometimes you follow, and sometimes you just try not to step on each other's toes. I figured the same principle applied to in-law relationships. I bit my tongue when she rearranged my spice cabinet according to proper alphabetical order. I smiled when she suggested I might benefit from a housekeeping service. I nodded when she explained why my furniture was blocking the natural flow of energy through my living room. But tolerance has its limits, and mine had been slowly eroding like the coastline outside my kitchen window. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday in March. David had called that morning to ask if I could watch the twins after school while he and Jessica attended a work function. Of course, I said yes. I always said yes when it came to spending time with my granddaughters, even though our interactions felt increasingly strained as they grew older and more influenced by their mother's worldview. I picked up Emma and Sophie from their private school in Coos Bay, noting how they climbed into my 15-year-old Honda Civic with barely concealed reluctance. The car was reliable, comfortable, and paid for everything a practical vehicle should be. But I could see them glancing at the cloth seats and manual windows, probably wondering why I hadn't upgraded to something with Bluetooth and heated seats like their friends' parents drove. We drove back to David's house, a sprawling ranch-style home in a newer subdivision where every lawn was perfectly manicured and every mailbox looked identical. Jessica had chosen the neighborhood specifically for its, quote, strong property values and excellent school district, though she often complained about the lack of authentic character compared to the historic homes downtown. The twins disappeared immediately into their respective bedrooms, probably to text friends about having to spend the afternoon with their old-fashioned grandmother. I settled into the kitchen to start dinner preparations, knowing that Jessica expected meals to be ready when she arrived home from work. It was an unspoken arrangement we'd fallen into over the years. I provided free childcare and meal preparation, and in return I was tolerated as a peripheral member of the family unit. I was seasoning chicken breasts when Jessica's voice drifted in from the living room. She was on the phone with someone, probably one of her real estate colleagues, based on the professional tone and industry jargon. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but the kitchen was open to the main living area, and voices carried in the modern home's open floor plan. "The problem is David's mother," Jessica was saying, her voice taking on that particular edge it acquired when discussing topics that irritated her. "She's just taking up room at this point. The house is falling apart, the neighborhood's going downhill, and she's sitting on what could be a decent piece of property if someone with vision got their hands on it." I froze, my hand still holding the salt shaker above the chicken. "I've been trying to convince David that it's time for her to make a practical decision," Jessica continued. "There are some really nice assisted living facilities in the area. She'd have people her own age to socialize with, activities planned for her, medical care on site. It would be so much better for everyone involved." The salt shaker slipped from my fingers, clattering against the counter. But Jessica was too absorbed in her conversation to notice. Honestly, at her age, what does she need all that space for? 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, that big yard she can barely maintain. It's just wasteful, and the location, it's walking distance to the harbor close to downtown. In the right hands, that property could be transformed into something really special. My hands found the edge of the counter, gripping it as Jessica's words continued to wash over me like cold water. "The thing is, she's stubborn. Old people get attached to their stuff, their routines. They don't understand that change can be positive. But David's too sentimental to have the conversation that needs to happen. Someone has to be the practical one in this family." I stood in that gleaming kitchen, surrounded by stainless steel appliances and granite countertops, feeling smaller than I had in years. Not because of the words themselves, though they stung, but because of the casual dismissal in Jessica's tone, the way she spoke about me like I was a problem to be solved, rather than a person with my own agency and desires. "She's just taking up room." The phrase echoed in my mind as I mechanically continued preparing dinner. Taking up room. As if my 73 years of life, my decades of love and sacrifice and contribution to this family, could be reduced to a simple matter of square footage. That evening I served dinner with my usual quiet efficiency. Jessica complimented the chicken and asked about my day. David discussed a new contract his company had landed. The twins shared highlights from their school activities. We sat around that modern dining table like a normal family, but Jessica's words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire only I could smell. After dinner, I helped clear the dishes and kissed my granddaughters goodbye. David walked me to my car, thanking me for watching the girls and asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. His kindness felt genuine, untainted by the calculation I'd heard in his wife's voice. But it also felt fragile, like something that could be easily influenced by the woman who shared his bed and managed his household. Driving home along the familiar coastal highway, I thought about rooms, about the space we occupy in this world and what it means to take up room. Jessica saw my house as wasted square footage, an inefficient use of valuable real estate. But to me, those rooms held everything that mattered. The bedroom where Robert and I had loved and laughed and grieved together, the kitchen where I'd fed my family for decades, the living room where my sons had learned to walk and my granddaughters had taken their first steps. I thought about the room I occupied in my family's life. Had I become nothing more than convenient free labor? A built-in babysitter and meal preparer who could be easily replaced by hired help? The woman who was just taking up room in their carefully planned existence? By the time I pulled into my driveway, something had shifted inside me. Not anger exactly, something quieter but more dangerous. A recognition that I had been allowing myself to be diminished, reduced to whatever role made everyone else's life easier. A realization that being polite and accommodating had somehow become synonymous with being invisible. That night, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, surrounded by all the things Jessica found outdated and impractical. Robert's reading chair, worn soft from decades of use. The coffee table we'd bought at an estate sale when we were young and poor. The family photos in mismatched frames, chronicling birthdays and holidays and ordinary moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time but now felt precious beyond measure. I wasn't just taking up room, I was taking up my room, my space, my life. Now. And for the first time in years, I began to wonder what would happen if I decided to take up a whole lot more. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after Jessica's phone conversation, I woke before dawn with an unusual energy coursing through my veins. It wasn't the restless anxiety that had plagued me since Robert's death, nor the weary resignation I'd grown accustomed to. This was something sharper, more focused, like the feeling you get when a puzzle piece finally clicks into place. I made my coffee in the French press Robert had brought back from a business trip to Seattle 20 years ago and carried it out to the back porch. The Oregon coast was performing its daily magic show, painting the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold, while the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon. This view, this moment of perfect solitude, was supposedly what I needed to give up for the sake of practical decisions. For the first time in months, I really looked at my property through objective eyes. The house itself was solid. Robert had been meticulous about maintenance, and I'd kept up with the essentials even after he was gone. The foundation was sound, the roof was only 8 years old, and the electrical had been updated in 2018. Yes, the paint was fading and the front steps needed attention, but these were cosmetic issues, not structural problems. The lot was generous by today's standards. Nearly 3/4 of an acre with mature Douglas firs, providing privacy and a garden that had fed my family for decades. The location Jessica coveted so much was indeed prime, a 10-minute walk to Bandon's historic downtown, 5 minutes to the harbor, where tourists came to watch the fishing boats and buy fresh crab. Property values in the area had been climbing steadily as remote work made coastal living more feasible for Portland professionals. Sitting there with my coffee, I began to see my home the way Jessica saw it, not as my sanctuary, but as an asset. A valuable piece of real estate being wasted on an old woman who apparently didn't deserve the space she occupied. The irony wasn't lost on me that a real estate agent was sizing up my property like a cat eyeing a bird, all while maintaining the pretense of family concern. But if Jessica could see dollar signs when she looked at my life, then perhaps it was time I started thinking like an investor myself. I spent that morning doing something I hadn't done in years. I researched. Robert had always handled our finances, and after his death, I'd been content to let our financial advisor manage the portfolio we'd built over 5 decades of careful saving. I knew we were comfortable, but I'd never delved into the specifics. Today felt like the right time to get acquainted with my own net worth. The numbers, when I finally tallied them up, were more substantial than I'd remembered. Robert's life insurance, our retirement savings, the pension from his 30 years with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, Social Security, and the rental income from a small duplex we'd bought as an investment property in the 1990s. We'd lived modestly, saved aggressively, and invested wisely. The woman Jessica dismissed as just taking up room was actually sitting on assets worth well over $1 million. More importantly, I owned my house outright. No mortgage, no liens, no debt of any kind. While Jessica was calculating how much my property might be worth to someone else, I was realizing how much financial freedom I actually possessed. That afternoon, I drove into downtown Bandon for the first time in weeks. The town was preparing for the spring tourist season, with shop owners refreshing their storefronts and restaurants expanding their outdoor seating. I parked in front of Morgan's Hardware, where I'd been shopping since David was in diapers, and walked the 3 blocks of historic downtown with fresh eyes. The buildings here told the story of Bandon's evolution from a working fishing village to a destination for retirees and tourists. Most of the structures dated from the 1920s and 1930s, rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1936. They were sturdy, practical buildings with character, the kind of authentic architecture Jessica claimed to value but never seemed to find in her modern subdivision. I noticed things I'd overlooked before. The coffee shop that always had a line of customers waiting for their specialty drinks. The art gallery featuring local artists that drew visitors from Portland and beyond. The bookstore that hosted author readings and wine tastings. The boutique hotel that charged $200 a night for rooms with harbor views. This wasn't a declining downtown struggling to survive. This was a thriving business district capitalizing on its coastal charm. But I also noticed the empty storefronts. 3 of them on Main Street alone, with for lease signs that had been there so long they'd started to fade. I stopped in front of the largest one, a corner building that had housed Peterson's department store for 40 years before the family retired and closed it down. The space was substantial, maybe 3,000 square feet with large windows facing both Main Street and Harbor Avenue. A small placard in the window provided leasing information. I found myself studying that building the way Jessica had mentally cataloged my house, seeing potential instead of just empty space. The location was perfect, the foot traffic was steady, and the building had the kind of bones that could support almost any business concept. Beautiful old building, isn't it? A voice said behind me. I turned to find Martha Chen, who owned the flower shop 2 doors down. We'd known each other casually for years, exchanging pleasantries at the post office and the grocery store. It really is, I agreed. Such a shame to see it sitting empty. The Peterson family's been pretty selective about tenants, Martha explained. They want someone who'll respect the building's history and contribute to the community character. Not just another chain store or vacation rental conversion. We chatted for a few more minutes about the changes in downtown, the seasonal rhythms of tourism, and the challenges facing small business owners. As Martha returned to her shop, I remained in front of the Peterson building, my mind beginning to spin possibilities. That evening, I called my financial advisor. Harold Brennan had been managing our accounts since Robert and I first started seriously saving in our 30s. He was surprised to hear from me. Usually our conversations were limited to quarterly reviews and tax planning. I'm thinking about making some changes, Harold, I told him. Possibly some significant investments. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss my options. Harold's voice perked up with professional interest. Of course, Lourdes. Are you thinking about real estate? Stocks? We've been pretty conservative with your portfolio, but there might be opportunities for growth if you're willing to take on a bit more risk. Real estate, I said, surprised by how certain I sounded. Commercial real estate specifically. We scheduled an appointment for Friday morning. After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of the wine Robert and I had been saving for a special occasion that never came. Tonight felt special enough. I'd lived my entire adult life making decisions based on what was practical, what was safe, what was best for everyone else. I'd deferred to Robert's judgment during our marriage, not because I was incapable, but because it seemed easier to let him handle the financial complexities. After his death, I'd continued that pattern, letting Harold manage our money while I focused on just getting through each day. But Jessica's casual cruelty had awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. If she could reduce my life to a real estate calculation, then perhaps it was time I started playing the game by those rules. The next morning, I called the number on the leasing sign at the Peterson building. A pleasant woman named Carol explained that the space was available for a 5-year lease with an option to purchase. The monthly rent was higher than I'd expected, but not unreasonable given the location and condition of the building. She offered to show me the interior that afternoon. The space was even more impressive from the inside. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, and enough natural light to make any business feel welcoming. The Petersons had maintained it well, updating the electrical and plumbing while preserving the architectural details that gave the building its character. There was a full basement for storage and a small office space on the second floor. "What kind of business are you planning?" Carol asked as we concluded the tour. The question hung in the air for a moment. I hadn't fully articulated the idea that had been forming in my mind, but suddenly it seemed perfectly clear. "A community center," I heard myself say. "Something that brings people together. Maybe a combination cafe, bookstore, and event space. Somewhere locals and tourists can connect with the real spirit of Bandon." Carol's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "That sounds wonderful. The Petersons would love that concept. They've been hoping someone would do something community-minded with the space." Walking home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about the future. Not the careful, modest contentment I'd settled for since Robert's death, but actual anticipation for what might come next. That evening, David called to check on me. It was his usual weekly call, dutiful and kind, but brief. "How are you doing, Mom? Do you need anything from town?" "I'm doing very well, actually," I said, and meant it. "I've been thinking about some new projects. Some changes." "Changes?" David's voice carried a note of concern. "What kind of changes?" "Oh, just some ideas I'm exploring. Nothing definitive yet." We talked for a few more minutes about the weather, the twins' school activities, and his work. David didn't mention Jessica's concerns about my living situation, and I didn't bring up what I'd overheard. But I could sense his unease with my mention of changes, as if any deviation from my current routine might require his intervention. After we hung up, I sat in Robert's old chair and thought about the conversation Jessica didn't know I'd heard. She'd dismissed me as someone who was just taking up room, too stubborn and set in my ways to make practical decisions about my future. What she didn't realize was that I was about to make the most practical decision of my life. I was going to show her exactly how much room an old woman could take up when she set her mind to it. The Peterson building was just the beginning. My meeting with Harold Brennan on Friday morning revealed possibilities I'd never imagined. Sitting in his oak-paneled office overlooking Coos Bay, I learned that careful decades of saving had positioned me far better than I'd understood. The duplex Robert and I had bought as a young couple was now worth 4 times what we'd paid for it. Our stock portfolio had weathered multiple market downturns and emerged stronger. Even the savings account I'd been dipping into for household expenses contained enough money to fund a substantial business venture. "You're in an enviable position, Lords," Harold said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed my financial summary. "Very liquid, very stable. If you're serious about commercial real estate investment, you have options most people only dream of." I dressed carefully for this meeting. My best navy suit, the one I'd worn to Robert's funeral, and the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted Harold to see me as a serious investor, not the grieving widow who'd been letting him make all the decisions for the past 5 years. "I'm more than serious," I told him. "I want to understand exactly what I can afford and what kind of return I should expect." We spent 2 hours going through scenarios. Harold showed me comparable commercial real estate transactions in coastal Oregon, explained the tax implications of different investment structures, and outlined financing options. By the time I left his office, I had a clear picture of my purchasing power and a folder full of documentation to support whatever decision I chose to make. But before I committed to anything, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was considering. The Peterson Building was just one opportunity in a downtown district that seemed ripe for strategic investment. If I was going to take up room, really take up room, I needed to know what other rooms might be available. That afternoon, I drove slowly through Bandon's business district, this time with a notebook and a purpose. I recorded addresses, noted for sale and for lease signs, and observed foot traffic patterns at different times of day. What I discovered surprised me. The old Coastal Bank building on Harbor Avenue had been vacant for 8 months, since the bank consolidated with a larger institution in Coos Bay. The building was smaller than the Peterson property, but had prime parking and visibility from the main tourist route. Next to it, the former Tide Pool restaurant sat empty after the owners retired to Arizona, its ocean view dining room gathering dust behind newspaper-covered windows. 3 blocks inland, the Murphy family's auto repair shop had recently closed when their son decided not to take over the business. The building was industrial rather than retail, but it occupied a full city block and included a large parking area that could serve multiple purposes. Most intriguing was the discovery that all of these properties shared something in common. They were owned by longtime Bandon families who had deep roots in the community, but needed to liquidate assets for retirement or estate planning. These weren't corporate owners looking to maximize profits from out-of-town investors. These were my neighbors, people who cared about what happened to their family businesses and the character of their town. I began making phone calls. Eleanor Peterson answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm with recognition when I introduced myself. "Oh, Lourdes! Carol mentioned you'd looked at the downtown building. Are you really thinking about opening a business?" We talked for an hour. Eleanor and her husband Frank had poured their lives into Peterson's department store. Watching it evolve from a practical necessity for local families to a quaint curiosity for tourists. They'd closed reluctantly when Frank's arthritis made the daily operations too challenging, but they'd been particular about potential tenants because the building represented their legacy. "We've had inquiries from vacation rental companies and a couple of chain stores," Eleanor explained. "But we want something that will contribute to the community, not just extract profit from it. Your idea about a community center sounds exactly like what Bandon needs." By the end of the conversation, Eleanor had invited me to dinner the following Sunday to discuss terms with Frank present. She also mentioned, almost casually, that they'd been considering selling rather than leasing if they found the right buyer. My call to Margaret Murphy about the auto repair property yielded similar results. The Murphys had been trying to sell for 6 months, but the zoning restrictions and specialized nature of the building had limited their options. Margaret sounded almost relieved when I explained that I was exploring multiple properties for a coordinated development project. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "what this town needs is someone with vision. Someone who understands that change doesn't have to mean losing what makes us special." The conversation that proved most enlightening was with Tom Henley, whose family had owned the Coastal Bank building since the 1940s. Tom had moved to Phoenix after retirement, but still felt responsible for the property that anchored one end of the historic district. "The bank paid us good rent for 40 years, Tom explained. "But now we're just paying taxes and maintenance on empty space. My wife keeps saying we should sell to whoever will pay the most, but I'd hate to see it become another souvenir shop or frozen yogurt franchise." I began to see the bigger picture. These weren't just individual properties coming available by coincidence. This was a generational transition happening all at once, as the families who'd built modern Bandon aged out of business ownership. Someone was going to acquire these properties and shape the next chapter of the town's development. It could be outside investors looking for quick returns, or it could be someone who actually cared about the community's future. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done since my teaching days. I created a comprehensive research project. I spread maps across my dining room table, compiled property records, analyzed foot traffic patterns, and studied successful small-town revitalization projects from across the Pacific Northwest. What emerged was a vision that went far beyond Jessica's dismissive comment about wasted space. I could see how the Peterson building, the bank, the restaurant, and the auto shop could be transformed into an interconnected district that honored Bandon's maritime heritage while meeting modern needs. A community center that actually functioned as the heart of the town, supported by complementary businesses that would draw both locals and visitors. The auto shop's large space could become a farmer's market and artisan showcase, giving local producers a reliable venue year-round. The bank building, with its vault and formal architecture, could house a maritime museum and event space. The restaurant's ocean view location was perfect for a casual cafe that could serve both morning coffee to locals and afternoon refreshments to tourists. And the Peterson building could anchor it all as a true community center, part bookstore, part meeting space, part cultural venue. But the more I researched, the more I realized the scope of what I was contemplating. This wasn't just buying a building or starting a business. This was essentially becoming the downtown district's primary developer and landlord. It would require not just financial resources, but political navigation, construction management, and ongoing community engagement. Most people my age were downsizing, simplifying, reducing their responsibilities. I was considering taking on the largest project of my life. Sunday dinner with the Petersons confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. This kind of comprehensive development was exactly what the town needed, and exactly what the current property owners hoped would happen. Frank Peterson, despite his arthritis, still had the sharp mind that had made their store successful for 4 decades. The problem with piecemeal development, he explained over Eleanor's pot roast, is that you end up with a hodgepodge of businesses that don't support each other. But if someone could acquire multiple properties and develop them as a coordinated district, that could transform the entire downtown. Eleanor nodded enthusiastically. We've watched other coastal towns lose their character to chains and vacation rentals. But we've also seen places like Astoria and Hood River reinvent themselves successfully. It takes someone with resources and vision. And community connections, Frank added, looking at me meaningfully. Someone people trust. As I drove home that evening, I thought about trust. About the difference between being seen as an outsider with deep pockets and being recognized as a community member with shared interests. Jessica viewed me as an obstacle to progress, someone whose sentimental attachment to the past prevented rational decision-making. But the Petersons, the Murphys, and the Henleys saw me as exactly what I was, a long-time resident with the financial means and personal investment to steward their legacy properties responsibly. That night, I called Harold and asked him to prepare a comprehensive financing analysis for a multi-property acquisition. Then I called each of the property owners and requested formal meetings to discuss purchase terms. Man, I was no longer just thinking about taking up room. I was preparing to own the room. Multiple rooms, in fact. An entire district's worth of rooms that would serve the community Jessica claimed I didn't contribute to. But I still hadn't told anyone in my family what I was planning. That conversation would come later, after the deals were finalized and the transformation had begun. After it was too late for anyone to talk me out of what they'd surely consider a foolish old woman's fantasy. Jessica thought I was just taking up space. She was about to learn that I intended to take up considerably more. The weeks that followed were unlike any I'd experienced since my teaching days, when I'd juggle lesson plans, parent conferences, and grading papers while somehow managing to keep 30 teenagers engaged in 19th century literature. Now, instead of Dickens and Whitman, I was immersed in property appraisals, zoning regulations, and architectural feasibility studies. I established a routine that kept me sharp and focused. Every morning at 7, I'd drive to the Driftwood Cafe downtown for coffee and local gossip, positioning myself to observe the natural flow of foot traffic and community interaction. By 8:30, I'd be at my improvised home office. Robert's old den transformed with filing cabinets, a new computer, and a large corkboard covered with property photos, financial projections, and timeline charts. My first formal negotiation was with the Petersons, partly because Eleanor had been so encouraging, and partly because their building would serve as the anchor for everything else I had planned. We met at their kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, with Frank's attorney present and Harold Brennan representing my interests. The Peterson building was listed at $285,000, which Harold assured me was fair for the location and condition. But I wanted more than just a real estate transaction. I wanted partners in the community transformation I was envisioning. I'd like to propose something unconventional, I began, spreading my preliminary development plans across their dining table. Instead of a simple purchase, what would you think about becoming founding partners in the Bandon Community District? Eleanor leaned forward, studying the sketches I'd commissioned from a Portland architectural firm. The drawings showed the Peterson Building as a multi-use community center, with a cafe occupying the sunny front corner, flexible meeting spaces throughout the main floor, and the second floor converted into offices for local nonprofits and small businesses. "This is exactly what we hoped would happen," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "Frank, look at this. She's even preserved the original display windows." Frank examined the plans with the careful attention he'd once given to store inventory. "The structural modifications look reasonable. And this concept of shared community space. It reminds me of what downtown used to be when we were young, a place where people naturally gathered." The attorney suggested an arrangement that surprised me with its creativity. Instead of an outright purchase, the Petersons would transfer ownership to a limited liability company we'd established together, with me holding controlling interest, but them retaining a stake in the building's future success. This structure would give them ongoing income, while ensuring their vision for the property was protected. "We're not just selling you a building," Frank explained. "We're investing in your ability to make something good happen here." My negotiations with Tom Henley about the old bank building took place over video calls to Phoenix, with Tom's daughter Linda participating from her home in Seattle. The family dynamics were more complex than the Petersons, with multiple heirs who had different priorities and comfort levels with risk. Tom was enthusiastic about my maritime museum concept for the former bank. "Dad always said that building was designed to last forever," Linda noted. "The vault alone is worth preserving. Kids would love to see where the town's money was once kept." But Tom's son Michael, calling in from his law office in Portland, was more skeptical. "I appreciate Mrs. Smith's community spirit, but we need to consider market value. That building could potentially sell for more to a developer planning vacation condos." I'd anticipated this objection and came prepared with both financial and emotional arguments. "You're absolutely right about market value," I acknowledged. "But I'm offering you something vacation condo developers can't, a guarantee that your father's legacy in this community will be honored and enhanced." The conversation continued for 90 minutes, covering everything from insurance and maintenance responsibilities to my long-term commitment to the project. By the end, we'd agreed on a purchase price of $195,000, with a clause allowing the Henley family to reclaim the property if I failed to complete the museum conversion within 3 years. Margaret Murphy proved to be the most pragmatic negotiator. She invited me to lunch at the Wheelhouse restaurant, where we could talk business while overlooking the harbor that had sustained our families for generations. "I'll be honest with you, lords," Margaret said, cutting straight to the point. "We've had 2 other offers on the auto shop property, one from a Portland developer who wants to build storage units, and another from a California company planning some kind of recreational vehicle park." I sipped my clam chowder and considered my response. The Murphy property was crucial to my vision. Its large, open space and central location made it perfect for the farmers market and artisan center I'd planned. But I also understood that Margaret had her own financial obligations to consider. "What would it take for you to choose community benefit over maximum profit?" I asked. Margaret smiled. "I was hoping you'd ask that question. The truth is, my husband built that business with his own hands. He'd roll over in his grave if it became a storage facility or RV park. But we also need enough money to fund our retirement." We spent the next hour working through creative financing options. I could offer $240,000 up front, slightly below the other offers, but with additional payments tied to the success of the farmers market. If local vendor fees exceeded certain benchmarks, the Murphys would receive bonus payments for the first 5 years. "You're essentially offering us a stake in your success," Margaret mused. "That feels right. Patrick always said the best business deals are the ones where everybody wins." The most challenging negotiation was for the former Tide Pool restaurant, partly because the ocean view location made it extraordinarily valuable, and partly because the owners, Carol and James Wright, were dealing with the emotional complexity of selling the business, where they'd spent 30 years building relationships with customers and community. We met at the restaurant itself, sitting in the empty dining room, while afternoon light streamed through windows that framed a perfect view of Bandon's iconic sea stacks. The Wrights had agreed to let me present my proposal, but their body language suggested deep ambivalence about any sale. "This place has been our whole life," Carol said, her hand resting on a table where she'd served countless anniversary dinners and birthday celebrations. "We know we need to sell, we're not getting any younger, and restaurant work is hard on the body. But every offer we've received has been from people who want to tear down what we built and start over." I opened my portfolio to show them architectural sketches of how the restaurant could be renovated rather than replaced. The dining room would be reconfigured as a casual cafe, but the basic layout and ocean view orientation would remain unchanged. The kitchen could be modernized while preserving the homey atmosphere that had made the tide pool a local favorite. "I'm not trying to buy your restaurant," I explained. "I'm trying to ensure it evolves into something that honors what you created here." James leaned back in his chair, studying the renovation plans. "You really think you can make all this work? The community center, the museum, the farmers market, and now a cafe? That's a lot of moving parts for one person to manage." It was a fair question, and one I'd been grappling with myself. The scope of what I was proposing was unprecedented for someone my age, especially someone without formal business management experience. But I'd spent 40 years managing classrooms full of teenagers, organizing school fundraisers, and coordinating community events. I understood how to bring people together around shared goals. "I'm not planning to do this alone," I told them. "The whole concept depends on community involvement. Local farmers for the market, regional artists for the craft center, volunteers for the museum, and experienced food service people for the cafe. I'm providing the initial investment and coordination, but the success depends on everyone contributing their expertise." Carol and James exchanged a long look, the kind of wordless communication that develops over decades of marriage and shared enterprise. "The asking price is $310,000, James finally said. "But if you're serious about preserving what we've built here, we might be willing to discuss owner financing." By the end of April, I had letters of intent signed for all 4 properties, pending final inspections and financing approval. The total investment would be just over $1 million, a staggering sum that represented most of my liquid assets. Harold had warned me repeatedly about the risks of putting so much capital into a single project, especially one dependent on community participation and tourist traffic. But sitting in my quiet house that evening, surrounded by documents and architectural plans, I felt more energized than I had since Robert's death. I was no longer just the widow who lived alone in the house with the overgrown garden. I was becoming the person who would transform downtown Bandon into a thriving community district. Jessica had dismissed me as someone who was just taking up room. In 6 months, I would own most of the commercial real estate in the town center. I'd be taking up considerably more room than she'd ever imagined possible. The question now was how and when to tell my family what I'd been planning in secret for 2 months. That conversation would test everything I'd learned about standing my ground and claiming my space in the world. The call came on a Tuesday morning in early May, just as I was reviewing contractor bids for the Peterson building renovation. David's voice carried a tension I hadn't heard since the week Robert was hospitalized. "Mom, we need to talk. Jessica saw you coming out of the bank yesterday with Harold Brennan, and there are rumors around town that you're buying up commercial properties. What's going on?" I set down my coffee cup and looked out at the garden, where the rhododendrons Robert had planted were blooming in spectacular profusion. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's concern had finally surfaced, just as my plans were becoming public knowledge. "Why don't you and Jessica come over for dinner on Friday?" I suggested. "I'll explain everything then. Mom, if you're having financial problems or if someone's taking advantage of you, we need to know now. Jessica says elderly people are often targeted by unscrupulous investment advisors." The condescension in his voice was so similar to Jessica's dismissive tone that Tuesday evening that I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. But I'd learned patience during 2 months of complex negotiations, and I wasn't about to lose my composure now. "I'm not having financial problems, David. I'm solving them. Friday at 6 o'clock. And bring the girls. They should hear this too." I spent the rest of the week preparing for what I knew would be the most important family meeting of my life. I organized financial documents, architectural plans, and business projections into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss as the confused rambling of a lonely old woman. I also prepared Robert's favorite meal, pot roast with garlic mashed potatoes, and fresh green beans from my garden. If we were going to have a difficult conversation, at least we'd have it over good food. Friday evening arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that makes the Oregon coast irresistible. Jessica arrived wearing a cream-colored blazer and pearls, looking like she was attending a business meeting rather than a family dinner. David seemed nervous, glancing between his wife and me as if expecting conflict to erupt at any moment. Emma and Sophie, now 14 and increasingly influenced by their mother's worldview, sat politely, but appeared more interested in their phones than whatever their grandmother might have to say. We made small talk through dinner, school activities, David's work projects, my garden progress. But I could feel the undercurrent of expectation and anxiety building as the meal progressed. Finally, as I served coffee and the apple pie I'd baked that afternoon, Jessica decided to address what they'd all come to discuss. "Lourdes, we're concerned about these stories we're hearing around town. People are saying you're making large financial commitments without consulting anyone. At your age, these kinds of decisions can be overwhelming." I looked around the table at my family. My son, who'd inherited his father's kind heart, but seemed to have misplaced his backbone. My granddaughters, who'd been raised to believe success meant avoiding risk and maintaining appearances. And Jessica, whose confident expression suggested she expected this conversation to end with my grateful acceptance of their guidance. "You're right," I said, standing to retrieve the folder I'd prepared. "I have been making large financial commitments. I think you should see exactly what I've been doing." I spread the architectural plans across the dining table, the same plans I'd shown to the Petersons, the Murphys, and the Wrights. But this time, I was watching my family's faces as they absorbed the scope of what I'd accomplished. "This is the Peterson building," I began, pointing to the detailed renovation drawings. "I'm converting it into a community center with a cafe, meeting spaces, and offices for local nonprofits. The purchase closed last Monday." David's fork clattered against his dessert plate. "You bought the Peterson building? When? How?" "With cash," I replied simply. "The same way I bought the old bank building for the Maritime Museum, the Murphy Auto Shop for the Farmers Market, and the Tide Pool restaurant space for the community cafe." The silence that followed was profound. Emma looked up from her phone with genuine surprise, while Sophie leaned forward to study the architectural drawings. David's face had gone pale, and Jessica's carefully composed expression was beginning to crack around the edges. "4 buildings?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, how much money are we talking about?" I consulted the financial summary Harold had prepared. "The total investment is $1.2 million. That includes purchase prices, renovation costs, and working capital for the first 2 years of operation." Jessica found her voice first, though it came out higher and tighter than usual. "Lourdes, you can't possibly have that kind of money available. Harold must have talked you into some kind of leveraged investment scheme. This is exactly the kind of predatory financial planning we were worried about." I pulled out my portfolio statements and placed them beside the architectural plans. "These are my current assets, Jessica. As you can see, the property investments represent less than 60% of my total portfolio. I'm not leveraged, I'm not at risk of financial hardship, and I'm certainly not being taken advantage of." David picked up the bank statements with shaking hands. His eyes widened as he scanned the numbers. Robert's life insurance payout, our retirement accounts, the accumulated value of investments we'd made over 5 decades of careful saving. "Jesus, Mom, I had no idea you and Dad had saved this much." "Your father was very good with money," I said. "And we lived modestly so we could invest for the future. This is that future." Jessica was studying the architectural plans with the focused attention she usually reserved for property listings. Despite her shock, her real estate training was kicking in, and I could see her calculating market values and rental potential. "Even if you can afford this," she said slowly, "it's an enormous risk. You're talking about essentially becoming the largest commercial landlord in downtown Bandon. What if the businesses fail? What if the town doesn't support these ventures? You could lose everything." It was a fair question, and one I'd wrestled with during many sleepless nights over the past 2 months. But I'd also done my homework in ways that Jessica's surface-level real estate knowledge couldn't match. The risk is manageable, I explained. Each property was purchased below market value from owners who prioritized community benefit over maximum profit. The buildings themselves are solid assets that will retain value regardless of business success. And the community support has been overwhelming. I already have waiting lists for farmers market spaces and nonprofit offices. Emma, who'd been quietly studying the plans, looked up with unexpected interest. Grandma, this museum in the old bank looks really cool. Are you going to have interactive exhibits? For the first time that evening, I smiled genuinely. That's exactly what I'm planning, sweetheart. The old vault will house artifacts from Bandon's fishing industry, and will have hands-on displays where visitors can learn about navigation, boat building, and marine ecology. Sophie joined the conversation, pointing to the farmers market layout. This looks like the Saturday market in Portland, but bigger. Will you have live music and food trucks too? Live music, yes. Food trucks won't be necessary because the community cafe will provide fresh, local food. The whole concept is designed to support local producers and artisans, rather than bringing in outside vendors. David was still staring at the financial documents, apparently trying to reconcile the mother he thought he knew with the woman who'd secretly assembled $1 million commercial real estate portfolio. "Why didn't you tell us what you were planning?" he asked finally. "We could have helped. We could have given you advice." The question hung in the air between us, laden with months of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. This was the moment I'd been preparing for. The conversation that would determine whether my family could accept the woman I'd become, or whether they'd continue trying to manage the woman they thought I should be. "David," I said gently, "what advice would you have given me?" He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again as the implications of the question sank in. Jessica, however, had no such hesitation. "We would have advised you to be more cautious, to consider smaller investments, maybe a single property, to work with local partners who understand the market better than Harold Brennan." "You would have advised me to think smaller," I said, "to take fewer risks, to be more practical and reasonable for someone my age." "Well, yes. That's what people do when they retire. They simplify their lives, not complicate them." I looked around the table at my family, these people I loved deeply, but who had somehow lost sight of who I really was, beneath the comfortable assumptions of age and widowhood. "Jessica," I said quietly, 2 months ago at Emma's birthday party, you told someone on the phone that I was just taking up room. You said my house was wasted space, and that someone with vision could transform the property into something special. The color drained from Jessica's face as she realized I'd heard her conversation. David looked confused, while Emma and Sophie watched with the fascination of teenagers witnessing unexpected adult drama. "You were right about one thing," I continued. "Someone with vision could transform underutilized property into something special. You just misjudged who that someone would be." Jessica's mouth opened and closed without sound, her usual confidence completely shattered. "I'm not taking up room anymore," I said, gathering the architectural plans into a neat stack. "I'm creating room. Room for community gatherings, room for local businesses to thrive, room for young families to build their lives in a town that values both tradition and innovation." David finally found his voice. "Mom, I'm sorry, I had no idea Jessica said that to you, but this is such a huge undertaking. Are you sure you can manage all of this?" I smiled at my son, this good man who'd somehow forgotten that his mother had once managed a classroom, a household, and a community volunteer schedule, while helping his father build the financial foundation that was now funding my new venture. "David, I spent 40 years teaching teenagers, organizing school fundraisers, and coordinating community events. I think I can handle a few buildings and some local businesses." For the first time that evening, David smiled back. "Yeah," he said slowly, "I guess you probably can." The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from construction timelines to insurance requirements to my plans for hiring local managers. By the time my family left that evening, the shock had begun giving way to something that looked almost like pride. Jessica was the last to speak as they gathered their coats. "Lourdes," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I underestimated you completely." I looked at this woman who'd spent years trying to manage and diminish me, and felt something shift in our relationship dynamic forever. "Jessica," I replied, "you're not the first person to make that mistake. But you might be the last." The months that followed my family's revelation were a whirlwind of construction noise, permit applications, and daily decisions that would have overwhelmed me just a year earlier. But I discovered something remarkable about myself. I thrived on the controlled chaos of bringing a complex vision to life. By June, downtown Bandon had become a construction zone with purpose. 4 different contractor crews worked simultaneously on the buildings I'd acquired, each project carefully coordinated to minimize disruption to existing businesses while maximizing efficiency. I'd established a temporary office in a rental space on 2nd Street, complete with a large conference table where I held weekly progress meetings with architects, contractors, and the growing team of community partners who'd joined the project. The Peterson building renovation revealed treasures we hadn't expected. When workers removed decades of accumulated drywall and dropped ceiling tiles, they uncovered original tin ceilings with intricate pressed patterns and hardwood floors beneath layers of linoleum and carpet. Eleanor Peterson cried when she saw the restored interior. It looked better than it had during the store's heyday in the 1980s. "Frank would have loved seeing this," she told me as we walked through the nearly completed community center. "He always said good bones never go out of style." The main floor had been transformed into flexible meeting spaces that could accommodate everything from book clubs to town hall meetings. The front corner housed Coastal Grounds, a cafe operated by Maria Santos, a young chef who'd returned to Bandon after culinary school in Portland. The second floor had been divided into affordable office spaces for 3 local nonprofits: the Bandon Historical Society, the Southern Oregon Coastland Conservancy, and a new organization supporting local artists and craftspeople. The old bank building presented different challenges but equally rewarding discoveries. The vault, with its massive steel door and safety deposit box arrays, had been preserved exactly as it was when the bank closed. Children's faces lit up when they peered inside and imagined the treasures once stored there. The main banking floor became an exhibition space featuring artifacts from Bandon's maritime history: fishing nets, navigation instruments, photographs of the harbor from different eras, and interactive displays explaining how coastal communities like ours had evolved over time. But it was the Murphy property transformation that generated the most excitement throughout the community. The cavernous auto repair space had been divided into vendor stalls with rolling doors that could open to create a continuous indoor-outdoor market. Local farmers finally had a weather-protected venue to sell year-round, while artists and craftspeople could display their work in professional quality spaces. Patricia Williams, who'd been making pottery in her garage for 20 years, was among the first vendors to sign up. "I never imagined I'd have a real studio space where people could watch me work," she told me during the market's soft opening. "This changes everything for local artists." The farmers market component exceeded even my optimistic projections. By August, we had 40 regular vendors selling everything from organic vegetables and grass-fed beef to handmade jewelry and woodworking. The Saturday morning market had become a regional destination, drawing visitors from as far away as Eugene and Medford. The former Tide Pool restaurant required the most delicate renovation approach. Carol and James Wright had poured their hearts into creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere, and I was determined to honor that legacy while updating the space for its new purpose. The Ocean View dining room became Tidewater Cafe, operated by Marcus Chen, Martha's son, who'd gained experience managing restaurants in San Francisco before returning home to raise his family. Marcus understood the balance between honoring tradition and embracing change. He kept many of Carol's most popular recipes, while adding contemporary touches that reflected current dietary preferences. The weekend brunch became legendary among tourists, while locals appreciated the casual weekday coffee service and the evening wine tastings featuring Oregon vintners. But the most unexpected development was how the project had transformed me personally. For 5 years after Robert's death, I'd felt like I was slowly disappearing, becoming smaller, quieter, less visible with each passing month. Now I woke up energized every morning, eager to tackle whatever challenges the day might bring. I'd learned to read architectural drawings, negotiate with suppliers, and manage multiple contractors simultaneously. I'd become fluent in zoning regulations, business licensing requirements, and marketing strategies. More importantly, I'd rediscovered my voice. The woman who'd spent decades deferring to others' opinions had become someone comfortable making executive decisions that affected dozens of employees and hundreds of community members. When disagreements arose, and they inevitably did, I found myself capable of listening to different perspectives while maintaining clear authority over final choices. The most gratifying change was in my relationship with my granddaughters. Emma and Sophie, initially skeptical about their grandmother's ambitious project, had become regular volunteers at the farmers market and museum. Emma discovered a talent for social media marketing, helping vendors promote their products through Instagram and TikTok. Sophie developed a fascination with local history, spending hours interviewing elderly community members about their memories of Bandon's fishing industry. "Grandma," Sophie told me one afternoon as we arranged historical photographs for a new museum display, "I used to think old people just sat around waiting to die. But you're like starting a whole new life." Her comment, delivered with typical teenage bluntness, captured something profound about what had happened to me over the past year. I hadn't just bought some buildings or started some businesses. I'd reclaimed my future. David had become one of my most reliable supporters, stopping by the construction sites regularly and offering practical advice based on his experience managing large projects for the lumber company. Our relationship had evolved from the dutiful son checking on his aging mother to genuine collaboration between equals. He'd even suggested that his company might relocate their regional office to one of the renovated downtown buildings. "You've created something really special here, Mom," he told me during the grand opening weekend in September. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, but I'm even more proud of how you've done it. You've brought the whole community together." Jessica's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The woman who'd dismissed me as just taking up room had become my most enthusiastic advocate. She'd helped coordinate the marketing campaign for the district's grand opening, leveraging her real estate contacts to spread word throughout the region. More significantly, she'd begun bringing clients to see the downtown revitalization as an example of how thoughtful development could enhance, rather than destroy, community character. "I was completely wrong about you," she told me during a quiet moment at the grand opening celebration. "I thought you were stuck in the past, but you were actually building the future." The grand opening weekend drew over 2,000 visitors to downtown Bandon. The weather cooperated with brilliant September sunshine, the kind of perfect coastal day that makes people want to relocate immediately. Local media covered the story extensively, but the most meaningful coverage came from regional business journals that recognized the project as a model for rural economic development. Standing on the Peterson Building's front porch that Sunday evening, watching families browse the farmers market while children fed ducks in the harbor beyond, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced since Robert's death. This wasn't just about proving Jessica wrong or showing my family what I was capable of achieving. This was about using the resources and experience I'd accumulated over 7 decades to create something genuinely beneficial for the community that had supported me through the hardest years of my life. The financial returns were exceeding projections. The community center's meeting spaces were booked months in advance. The farmers market vendors were reporting sales that allowed them to expand their operations. The museum was attracting visitors year-round, not just during the summer tourist season. Most importantly, other property owners downtown were investing in renovations and improvements, creating a ripple effect that was transforming the entire business district. But the real measure of success wasn't financial, it was social. Downtown Bandon had become a gathering place again, the kind of community heart that small towns lose when big box stores and strip malls drain commercial activity away from historic centers. Children played in the small park we'd created behind the farmers market while their parents shopped and socialized. Elderly residents met for coffee at coastal grounds before attending watercolor classes in the community center's art studio. Teenagers hung out at Tidewater Cafe after school, doing homework while sharing nachos and comparing social media posts. I'd taken up room, all right. I'd taken up enough room to give an entire community space to thrive. That night, I sat on my front porch with a glass of wine, watching the lights twinkle in the downtown district I'd helped create. Jessica's cruel comment about me just taking up room had been intended to diminish me, to reduce my life to a real estate calculation. Instead, it had awakened something I'd forgotten I possessed: the power to shape my environment rather than simply endure it. I was 73 years old, and I'd just begun the most important work of my life. Winter brought unexpected challenges and even more unexpected opportunities. The Oregon coast's notorious storms tested both the structural integrity of my renovated buildings and the resilience of the community we'd built around them. But what emerged from those gray months was proof that we'd created something genuinely sustainable, rather than just a fair-weather attraction. The first major test came in November, when a Pacific storm knocked out power to most of downtown Bandon for 36 hours. Instead of closing down and waiting for restoration, the community center became an impromptu emergency shelter. The backup generator I'd insisted on installing kept basic lighting and heat running, while Maria's Cafe served hot soup and coffee from camping stoves. Families with small children gathered in the main meeting room, sharing blankets and telling stories while the wind howled outside. Eleanor Peterson, now 82 and moving more slowly than she once had, spent both nights at the center helping coordinate volunteer efforts. "This is exactly what Frank and I dreamed this space would become," she told me, as we served breakfast to a family whose vacation rental had lost heat. "Not just a place for meetings and events, but a real community anchor." The storm actually strengthened our relationships with neighboring business owners who hadn't initially embraced the downtown transformation. Janet Morrison, who'd been skeptical about the farmers market affecting foot traffic to her gift shop, ended up housing 3 vendor families whose mobile homes had lost power. By spring, she'd become one of our most vocal advocates, crediting the increased downtown activity with her best sales year in a decade. The Maritime Museum faced its own winter trial when a leak in the old bank building's roof threatened the historical artifact collection. Instead of panicking, I found myself calmly coordinating emergency repairs while rallying volunteers to help move exhibits to safety. The incident revealed something important about the leadership skills I'd developed. I'd learned to treat crises as problems to solve rather than disasters to endure. More significantly, the near miss with the artifacts prompted the Bandon Historical Society to launch a major collection digitization project. Sophie, who'd become fascinated with local history during her volunteer work, spearheaded an effort to interview elderly residents and record their memories before they were lost. Her project eventually became a multimedia exhibition that attracted visitors from universities and museums throughout the Pacific Northwest. "Grandma Lourdes," she told me while reviewing transcripts of her interviews, "did you know that Great-Grandpa Robert's fishing boat was featured in a documentary about Oregon coastal communities in the 1970s? Mrs. Patterson has a copy of the film and she wants to donate it to the museum." These discoveries kept multiplying throughout the winter. The community center's evening programs had attracted retired teachers, librarians, and craftspeople who began sharing skills and knowledge I hadn't realized existed in our small town. Margaret Hoffman, the former librarian, started offering genealogy research workshops that helped families trace their connections to Bandon's fishing and logging history. Tom Bradley, who'd spent 40 years as a boat builder, began teaching traditional woodworking techniques to teenagers who'd never imagined they could create something beautiful with their hands. By February, I realized we'd accidentally created something more valuable than a business district or tourist attraction. We'd built an intergenerational learning community where knowledge flowed in all directions. Teenagers taught seniors about social media marketing while learning traditional crafts from master artisans. Young parents discovered that elderly neighbors possessed child-rearing wisdom that complemented modern parenting approaches. Recent college graduates found mentors among business owners who'd weathered multiple economic cycles. The success had begun attracting attention from beyond Bandon. A delegation from the Oregon Department of Economic Development toured the district in March, documenting our approach as a potential model for other rural communities. They were particularly interested in how we'd financed the project without relying on government grants or outside investment capital. "What you've accomplished here demonstrates that rural communities don't need to wait for outside saviors," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the department's rural development specialist. "You've shown that local resources, properly organized and deployed, can create sustainable economic growth while preserving community character." The state's interest led to speaking invitations at economic development conferences throughout the Pacific Northwest. I found myself standing before audiences of city planners, business leaders, and community organizers, sharing lessons learned from what many were calling the Bandon model. These presentations forced me to articulate something I'd been feeling but hadn't fully understood: the difference between development that extracts value from a community and development that builds community capacity. The vacation condo projects and chain store developments that Jessica had once considered inevitable would have generated profits for outside investors while contributing little to local social or economic resilience. Our approach had created assets that belonged to and served the community that supported them. The most unexpected speaking invitation came from Portland State University's Center for Community Development. They wanted me to address a graduate seminar on rural economic policy. Standing before a classroom full of students young enough to be my grandchildren, I felt the same nervous excitement I'd experienced during my first year of teaching 45 years earlier. "You're here because you want to help communities thrive," I told them. "But remember that every community already contains the resources it needs to thrive. Your job isn't to bring solutions from outside. It's to help people recognize and organize the assets they already possess." One student raised her hand. "Mrs. Smith, how did you know your community was ready for this kind of transformation? How do you identify that readiness?" The question stopped me for a moment, because I realized I'd never consciously assessed community readiness. I'd simply started with my own need to respond to a personal slight and discovered that my individual healing aligned with broader community needs. I didn't start with a community development strategy, I admitted. I started with a personal decision to stop accepting other people's limitations on my life. The community responded because they'd been waiting for someone to take the first step. That exchange led to longer conversations about the relationship between individual agency and community transformation. Many of the students had been trained to think in terms of systemic change requiring comprehensive planning and significant external resources. My experience suggested that sometimes the most effective community development begins with one person deciding to act differently, creating space for others to do the same. Spring brought new challenges as our success began attracting the kind of attention I'd hoped to avoid. A development company from California expressed interest in purchasing the entire downtown district, offering prices that would have doubled my initial investment. A vacation rental management company wanted to convert the second floor of the Peterson building into short-term accommodations for tourists. Even a major restaurant chain inquired about franchising opportunities in our renovated spaces. Each offer represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what we'd built. They saw profitable real estate assets. I saw a community ecosystem that couldn't be replicated or relocated. The decision to reject these overtures was easy, but communicating that decision required careful explanation to avoid appearing ungrateful or financially naive. "The value of what we've created here can't be measured in dollars alone," I explained to the California Development Company's representative. "We've built social capital, community resilience, and local economic capacity. Those assets would be destroyed if ownership moved to outside investors focused solely on financial returns." The pressure intensified when real estate values throughout downtown began rising rapidly in response to our success. Longtime residents worried about being priced out of the community they'd helped revitalize. Property taxes increased as assessments reflected the improved business district. Some elderly homeowners on fixed incomes found themselves unable to afford the community they'd called home for decades. This unintended consequence forced me to grapple with complex questions about gentrification and community preservation that I'd naively assumed we could avoid. Success had created new problems that required creative solutions I hadn't anticipated when I'd first decided to buy the Peterson building. Working with the City Council and local nonprofit organizations, we developed innovative approaches to affordable housing that leveraged the district's success for community benefit. The Historical Society used its increased museum revenue to establish a property tax assistance fund for longtime residents. The farmers market vendors created a profit-sharing program that helped fund affordable housing development. The community center began hosting financial literacy workshops to help residents navigate the changing economic landscape. These efforts weren't perfect solutions, but they represented the kind of community-controlled response to development pressure that most small towns lack the resources to attempt. Our success had given us tools to address the problems that success itself had created. By summer's end, I realized that my response to Jessica's dismissive comment had evolved into something far beyond personal vindication. I'd accidentally become a catalyst for broader conversations about aging, community development, and the untapped potential that exists in places and people that society too often overlooks. The woman who'd been just taking up room had created space for an entire community to reimagine its future. But more importantly, I discovered that transformation is contagious. When one person claims their full potential, it gives others permission to do the same. 2 years have passed since that Tuesday evening, when Jessica's words changed the trajectory of my life forever. As I write this, I'm sitting in my favorite corner of Coastal Grounds Cafe, watching the morning rush of locals who stop for coffee before work, and tourists who've discovered that downtown Bandon offers something they can't find in their guidebooks: authentic community life happening in real time. The numbers tell part of the story. The Bandon Community District now employs 47 people directly, with another 35 jobs created in supporting businesses throughout the town. Property values have stabilized at levels that reflect genuine economic vitality rather than speculative investment. The farmers market has expanded to 3 days a week, serving vendors from throughout southern Oregon. The Maritime Museum has become a required stop for school field trips from as far away as Sacramento and Seattle. But statistics can't capture what it feels like to watch Emma, now 16, confidently leading tours of the Maritime Museum while explaining the connection between historical fishing techniques and current marine conservation efforts. They can't measure Sophie's pride when she shows visitors the oral history archive she's built, or the way her eyes light up when elderly residents trust her with stories they've never shared with anyone else. The deeper transformation is visible in smaller moments that outsiders might not notice. Like watching Margaret Hoffman teach a young mother how to research her family's immigration records, creating connections that span generations and continents. Or seeing Tom Bradley's woodworking students, ranging in age from 14 to 70, collaborate on a community sculpture that now stands in the small park behind the farmers market. Most meaningful to me is what's happened within my own family. David has become not just a supportive son, but a genuine business partner, bringing his project management expertise to help expand our affordable housing initiatives. He's also brought Jessica into several of our development discussions, where her real estate knowledge contributes to solutions rather than problems. Jessica herself has undergone a transformation that sometimes seems more dramatic than my own. The woman who once dismissed me as outdated and impractical now seeks my advice on complex development projects throughout the region. More importantly, she's learned to see community development as something more sophisticated than simple profit maximization. I spent years thinking that success meant replacing old things with new things, she told me recently as we walked through the district during the busy Saturday market. But what you've done here is show how to honor what's valuable from the past while creating space for the future. That's actually much harder than just tearing down and starting over. The comment revealed how much her perspective had evolved, but it also highlighted something I'd been thinking about increasingly: the difference between change that destroys and change that builds. Jessica's original vision for my property would have erased the life Robert and I had built together, replacing it with something that served other people's needs. My response had been to create change that honored the past, while expanding possibilities for the future. Liler balay Robber race and hialan kejialan. This distinction has become central to how I approach new opportunities. This success in Bandon has generated invitations to consult on similar projects in other coastal communities. Each town presents unique challenges and assets, but the underlying principles remain consistent. Start with what exists, involve the people who will be affected, and design solutions that build local capacity rather than creating dependence on outside resources. Last month, I spent a week in Brookings, Oregon, working with a group of retirees who wanted to revitalize their downtown core. Like me, they'd been dismissed by younger family members as too old, and set in their ways to understand modern economic realities. Like me, they possessed financial resources and community knowledge that others had overlooked. Like me, they needed someone to show them that age could be an asset rather than a limitation in creating positive change. The assumption is that innovation comes from young people with fresh ideas, explained Ruth Morrison, a 78-year-old former bank president who was leading the Brookings effort. But we have something young people lack: patience, perspective, and the financial security to take risks for long-term benefit rather than short-term profit. Her insight resonated deeply because it captured something essential about what had happened to me. The dismissal I'd experienced from Jessica hadn't just been about my clothes or my house. It had been about the assumption that older people become irrelevant to their community's futures. That assumption had prevented my family from recognizing resources and capabilities that were hiding in plain sight. The irony is profound. Jessica had been right that someone with vision could transform underutilized property into something special. She'd simply failed to recognize that I was that someone. Her comment about me just taking up room had been intended to marginalize me, but it had actually awakened capacities I'd forgotten I possessed. This awakening has continued expanding in unexpected directions. Last year, I was invited to join the Oregon Governor's Commission on Rural Economic Development, bringing the perspective of successful grassroots community building to policy discussions typically dominated by academic theorists and corporate consultants. The experience has been both frustrating and enlightening, as I've learned how difficult it is to translate lived experience into policy recommendations that can be implemented across diverse communities. The most rewarding aspect of this broader engagement has been connecting with other older adults who've been inspired to reclaim agency in their own communities. I receive letters and emails from women and men in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who've decided to stop accepting limitations others place on their potential. Some have started businesses, others have run for local office, still others have organized community improvement projects. Each story reinforces my belief that there is an enormous reservoir of untapped capacity among older adults who've been socialized to step aside and let younger people lead. But perhaps the most significant change has been internal. The woman who spent 5 years after Robert's death feeling invisible and irrelevant has discovered that she was never actually invisible. She'd simply learned to hide. The skills I'd developed during 40 years of teaching, the financial resources Robert and I had accumulated through careful planning, the community relationships I'd built over 7 decades of life in Bandon, none of these had disappeared when I turned 70. They'd simply been waiting for me to remember they existed. This recognition has changed how I approach aging itself. Instead of seeing each passing year as a diminishment of capacity, I've learned to view experience as accumulated capital that can be invested in new ventures. The patience that comes with having weathered multiple life challenges, the perspective that comes from watching communities evolve over decades, the financial security that comes from a lifetime of careful saving. These are assets that can be leveraged for community benefit in ways that younger people often can't match. The downtown district continues evolving, with new businesses and programs launching regularly. This month, we're opening a business incubator for local entrepreneurs, providing affordable commercial space and mentorship for people starting their own ventures. Next year, we're planning a partnership with Oregon State University's Extension program to create a demonstration site for sustainable coastal agriculture. The possibilities seem endless because we've built a foundation that can support continued growth and adaptation. But the most important lesson from this entire experience isn't about real estate development or community organizing, or even about proving wrong the people who underestimate older adults. It's about the power of deciding, at any age, to stop accepting other people's definitions of who you are and what you're capable of achieving. Jessica thought she was describing a problem when she said I was just taking up room. She had no idea she was identifying an opportunity. The room I was taking up turned out to be exactly the space our community needed to thrive. Sometimes the most powerful response to dismissal isn't argument or explanation. It's demonstration. Sometimes the best way to prove you belong in the room is to build a bigger room with space for everyone. I'm 75 years old now, and I'm just getting started. The woman who was once just taking up room has learned something that Jessica's real estate training never taught her. The most valuable spaces aren't the ones you can sell, but the ones you create for others to flourish. And that's a lesson worth every square foot. Shia. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.